Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating text that presents a highly radical and frankly controversial premise regarding Japan's economic and spiritual future. We're diving into a source that boldly claims the only way to save a nation drowning in debt is to completely reinvent its relationship with capitalism. It's a provocative read for sure, and one that really forces us to question the balance between government support and individual responsibility. Okay, let's just dive right into this. Right off the bat, the source text hits us with a startling central question, one that totally challenges our everyday assumptions. I mean, we usually think of Japan as this titan of global capitalism, right? Well, the text throws a massive curveball by asking, is Japan actually the world's last great socialist state? It's a shocking way to frame it. But as we break this down, you're going to see exactly how the author pieces together this heavily debated argument. So, here is our blueprint for today. We'll start with the collapsing socialist state, then move to the philosophy of Seki Shoidai, rethinking social security, transport and industry, and finally, agriculture and education. All right, let's jump straight into part one, the collapsing last socialist state. The source text literally dubs Japan the last socialist state that is currently collapsing. Now, the core argument here is that an over-reliance on the government, essentially expecting the state to manage almost every aspect of civic life, has fundamentally compromised Japan's capitalist foundations. The author argues that while communist states like the Soviet Union collapsed loudly and publicly, Japan silently morphed into a system that mirrors those socialist ideals of total state care. And according to the text, this is blinding the public to an impending economic disaster. Backing up the text's severe diagnosis is a mathematical crisis. Think about this number, 900 trillion yen. That is the staggering national debt explicitly mentioned in the source material at the time it was written. The text points to this massive figure to argue that this so-called socialist system of heavy government expenditure is simply a mathematical impossibility in the long run. I mean, you just can't spend drastically more than you earn year after year without eventually hitting a brick wall. And building on that, the source makes the startling assertion that expecting the state to manage your post-retirement life completely is a dangerous, unsustainable illusion. It argues that a system where the government is expected to fully take care of everyone over the age of 65 is essentially a complete communist ideal, and it's one that, in the author's view, is actively causing the nation to suffer because it simply cannot be funded. Which brings us to the proposed solution in Part 2, Capitalism's Origin, or Seki Shoidai. The source argues we have to return to a very specific, traditional mindset, Seki Shoidai. This is a principle famously attributed to the historical Japanese philosopher Sontoku Ninomiya. It translates roughly to the idea that accumulating small, diligent efforts inevitably leads to great success. The text views this exact concept as the true missing spirit of a functional capitalist society. It's essentially the ultimate rejection of getting something for nothing. The text really emphasizes Sontoku Ninomiya's spirit of diligence, ingenuity, and just continuous, grinding effort. The author is calling for a profound return to these traditional values. The argument being made is that true national prosperity doesn't come from government handouts, but from the gritty, relentless effort and self-help of individual citizens, people who are willing to grit their teeth and build wealth step by step. Let's see how that applies to policy in Part 3, the restoration from Social Security. The author presents a really stark dichotomy for us here. On one hand, you have what the text calls the socialist dream, which is the expectation of total state care for things like pensions and medical expenses. On the other hand, you have the capitalist reality. This insists that citizens absolutely must abandon their reliance on taxes to save them in old age. Instead, they need to embrace self-defense, proper life planning, and rigorous personal savings. To emphasize just how radical this shift needs to be, the source uses a brilliant, striking historical analogy. It calls for a modern Taisei Hokan, which history buffs will recognize as the great return of political power that ended the shogunate in Japan. By using this specific term, the author is advocating for a total dismantling of heavy state welfare systems, effectively returning the power and responsibility of survival back to the individual. It's a dramatic call to completely rewrite the modern social contract. Moving on to the broader economic strategy in Part 4, fusing transport revolution and new industry. The author lays out a fascinating domino effect strategy that they claim will bring immense wealth back to regional areas. It's a clear four-step sequence. Step 1, build advanced transportation, specifically linear motor cars. Step 2, use that technology to completely change the accessibility of rural Japan. Step 3. Lure in factories and businesses with really bold tax incentives. And Step 4. Use this brand new infrastructure to aggressively foster a culture of local entrepreneurship. The text places a very specific emphasis on the linear Shinkansen. For the author, this isn't just a fast train. It's the primary physical catalyst for a complete transportation revolution. The argument is that high-speed connectivity will totally erase the geographical disadvantages of rural areas. It's like turning previously overlooked distant regions into prime real estate for new industries overnight.
But high-speed trains aren't enough on their own. The author insists on sweeping structural changes to make these newly connected regions attractive to private industry. This involves massive deregulation, offering major tax breaks so it's actually cheaper for companies to build factories in the Japanese countryside than overseas, and, this is crucial, forcing local government bureaucrats to adopt an entrepreneurial, business-first mindset.
Now for the final piece of the puzzle. Part 5. Innovations in Agriculture and Education. The text launches a heavy critique on current defensive farming practices. It argues that a lot of farming is done mostly by part-time farmers who are just holding on to land for inheritance tax purposes. The text demands a complete pivot to aggressive, high-tech, and highly profitable agriculture that creates premium products the rest of the world desperately wants to buy. To make this concept concrete, the source highlights the cultivation of luxury, high-sugar, perfectly ripe sweet tomatoes. The author points out that if you create an agricultural product with incredibly high quality and status appeal, people will pay top dollar for it, literally just like they do for luxury suits or high-end watches. It's all about transitioning to what they call value-added agriculture. But agriculture isn't the only sector the text puts on the chopping block. The source uses uncompromising language, stating that all sacred cows must be systematically dismantled and reviewed. And when it comes to sacred cows, the author takes direct aim at the traditional state-run public education system, arguing that it is fundamentally failing to produce the kind of sharp entrepreneurial minds the country needs. This leads to perhaps one of the most highly controversial proposals in the entire text. The author suggests we should formally recognize practical, high-level learning that is happening outside the public school system. Specifically, the text argues that top-tier private cram schools should actually be certified as official schools. This would allow kids to bypass the traditional public school grind, get a highly effective education, and significantly reduce their overall time burden. To ground this radical educational theory in reality, the source actually names famous, elite Japanese cram schools, specifically pointing out Sapex and Yotsuya Otsuka. The argument is that these institutions are already providing a higher quality, more advanced education than standard elementary schools. So, the author says, the government should just acknowledge reality and grant them official school status. So, let's just zoom out for a second and summarize the core takeaways from this explainer. The author's blueprint for saving a heavily indebted Japan intertwines spiritual philosophy directly with hardline economic policy. It demands abandoning state reliance in favor of individual self-help. It requires embracing the Sekishoi Dai spirit of diligent, incremental effort. And on a practical level, it calls for executing radical, unapologetic deregulation across welfare, transport, agriculture, and even education. We've definitely covered a lot of ground today, unpacking a text that doesn't just suggest minor tweaks, but demands a total societal overhaul. It leaves us with a truly provocative question to ponder. Is this extreme return to raw self-reliance and deregulation the only way to save a heavily indebted nation from mathematical collapse? It's a stark vision, for sure, but it's one that forces us to deeply evaluate what we expect from our society, and more importantly, what we expect from ourselves. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the systems around you. All right, let's just dive right in. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating and frankly, highly unconventional economic text. The source material we're looking at proposes an absolute radical restructuring of global finance. I mean, it doesn't just suggest tweaking interest rates or adjusting taxes. No, it advocates for a complete reimagining of where money comes from, who manages it, and what its ultimate purpose should actually be on a global scale. So here is the massive, provocative core question the text attempts to answer. Can religious institutions act as global banks to drive economic growth? It argues for a total paradigm shift in how we view capital and who we actually trust to distribute it. Typically, you and I think of central banks and governments as the sole custodians of national wealth, right? But this text completely challenges that fundamental assumption.
asking us to consider what happens when faith-based organizations step up as the primary economic engines.
To set the stage, the source material kicks off with Chapter 2, titled Create New Industries with Big Ideas, and it has a really unique framing. It's actually presented as a spiritual message, essentially a channeling, from the historical Japanese industrialist Eiichi Shibusawa, dated February 11, 2010. By invoking such a foundational figure of modern Japanese capitalism, the text establishes a sweeping critique of our modern economic system. It's using a historical voice of authority to propose incredibly futuristic ideas.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover Japan's economic stagnation, the National Policy Bank, religion as financial power, the Earth Bank vision, and finally, redefining global wealth.
Section 1. Japan's economic stagnation, the critique of the status quo.
The text pulls absolutely no punches here. It argues that the bureaucratic, safety-first inertia of institutions like the Bank of Japan and various government agencies actually acts as a device that incapacitates people. It's a strong claim. By prioritizing extreme caution and this slow, permission-based decision-making, the source claims these institutions are actively stifling vital economic growth. The central argument is that a lack of entrepreneurial spirit and a total failure to fund risk-taking venture enterprises has led directly to a stagnant, declining economy. Section 2. The National Policy Bank, Fostering Venture Capital.
So what's the proposed fix? There's a stark contrast between the old way and the proposed new way. Instead of a slow-moving central bank, the text proposes a national policy bank. This new entity would be equipped with a true management mindset. It would be completely comfortable taking calculated risks, acting decisively, and specifically targeting venture enterprises to stimulate real, aggressive economic expansion.
According to the source, this new bank's primary mission would be fundamentally different from just holding deposits or buying up government bonds. It's all about increasing the velocity of money. The author argues that true national power comes from raising up new industries and visionary companies. Therefore, a banking system needs to be designed not just to safeguard wealth, but to actively create it by placing bold bets on the future. Honestly, think of it less like a traditional bank vault and much more like an aggressive venture capital fund for the entire nation.
Section 3. Religion as financial power, justifying religious banking. Now you might be wondering, how exactly does religion fit into all of this? Well, to justify religious organizations wielding massive financial power, the author draws some bold parallels to existing frameworks. The text explicitly points to the Vatican Bank's role within Catholicism and the sprawling global influence of Islamic finance. The argument here is that having a religious institution operate a bank or manage massive financial resources is not unprecedented at all. Rather, it's a historically proven method for religions to execute their earthly missions. By observing the Islamic finance model, where religious teachings directly inform financial principles, right down to the permissibility of charging interest, the author argues that erasing the rigid distinction between religion and government economics is an already proven concept. The author suggests that their own religious movement can, and absolutely should, establish its own foundational economic principles to guide large-scale financial operations.
Section 4. The Earth Bank Vision, Scaling to Global Prosperity. This is where things get truly global. The text envisions the creation of what it calls an Earth Bank. Because a national central bank is viewed as structurally too small and constrained by borders, this new institution would act as a massive, globally focused fund. And what's fascinating is where they suggest directing this capital. They want to put it heavily into futuristic frontiers, specifically the space industry.
But what is the actual point of all this accumulation? The ultimate objective of this institution isn't just getting rich for the sake of it. The stated mission of the Earth Bank is actually freeing the world from poverty. The logic presented in the text is that you cannot eradicate poverty by merely redistributing existing limited resources. Instead, you have to drastically increase the total absolute volume of wealth in the world, and you do that through massive, unorthodox financial expansion and technological investment.
Section 5. Redefining Global Wealth, the Step-by-Step Evolution.
To make this a reality, the source lays out a highly specific, mechanical pathway. And the text makes it clear, make sure not to mistake the step numbers here. The paradigm of redefining wealth and finance must transition first into phase 1, 1, 3, 4, which acts as a critical intermediary stage before finally bridging to the ultimate systemic goal, phase 1, 2, 3, 4. While these specific step numbers might sound like a strict formula, they essentially map out the vital shift from traditional, bureaucratic finance to a globally integrated, religiously backed economy.
And this rigid progression culminates in an incredibly ambitious proposal, establishing a brand new global currency standard. The text envisions a scenario where a new Japanese yen, one that is fully backed by this new religious financial paradigm and completely untethered from old bureaucratic limitations, becomes the dominant global reserve currency. It is a vision where the spiritual values of the movement become fundamentally embedded in the very unit of global trade itself.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, provocative question to ponder. What are the implications when spiritual ideology merges completely with global monetary policy? The source material presents a meticulously structured argument for dismantling traditional central banking and replacing it with a hyper-growth, faith-driven financial engine. Whether you view that as an inspiring utopian blueprint or a highly controversial merging of church and market, the text forces us to ask, what does the world look like when the people who define our spiritual values are the exact same people printing the money? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning the systems around you.
Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a really fascinating blueprint for national financial recovery found in Chapter 3 of our source text. Now, this is definitely not your standard economic white paper. We're looking at a highly unique perspective that frames a nation's massive debt through the lens of a historical corporate restructuring.
Imagine trying to fix a 900 trillion yen deficit. Let's dive into this by exploring the text's core premise, which is applying the turnaround strategies of Uesugi Yozan to modern Japan. For a little historical context here, Uesugi Yozan was a legendary Edo period leader, famous for saving his domain from the brink of absolute bankruptcy through severe austerity and economic stimulation. The source material basically channels his perspective to tackle modern Japan's staggering national debt. So, how exactly does one manage a financial crisis of that magnitude?
To answer that, here is our roadmap for this turnaround plan. 1. A warning to modern Japan. 2. The risk of relying on China. 3. No tax hike without growth. 4. Thorough administrative reform. And 5. Public-private management sense.
Just to set the stage, we're looking directly at Chapter 3 from the source text. Interestingly, this is framed as a spiritual message from Uesugi Yozan recorded back in April 2010. It's a very specific and honestly unorthodox critique of the political climate at the time, offering a pretty radical roadmap out of the crisis.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, a warning to modern Japan.
The text really doesn't pull any punches here. It takes a hard look at the 2010 government led by the Democratic Party of Japan at the time and heavily criticizes their focus on what it calls socialist-style handouts. The core argument? You can't just distribute money without actually creating new wealth. It's fundamentally flawed. The author insists that leadership has to prioritize actual value creation, exactly like a business focusing on real revenue instead of just burning through its capital.
So what did this mismanagement look like, according to the source? Well, things like child allowances are called out as just shallow vote-gathering tactics that completely missed a long-term operational strategy. On top of that, the text points out major foreign policy blind spots, specifically citing naive approaches to the Okinawa base relocation and being totally unprepared for North Korean missile threats. Basically, from this perspective, the government was failing at running Japan Inc. both domestically and abroad.
Moving right along to Section 2, the risk of relying on China.
This number right here, 10, is a huge deal in the text. The source emphasizes that China's population is roughly 10 times that of Japan. Why does that matter so much? Because trying to compete in a pure manufacturing volume war or competing on cheap labor is mathematically and practically impossible. It's just a losing game for a much smaller population. And the source gives a really blunt warning about this. It characterizes the Chinese economy of that era as a highly unstable, military-driven bubble. The author is absolutely adamant here. This bubble will inevitably collapse. So tethering Japan's economic recovery to China's growth, the text argues that is incredibly dangerous. The solution, according to this blueprint, is a massive pivot. Japan has to stop relying on external forces and hyper-evolve its own high-value-added domestic industries to survive. We're talking about innovating so much that you create technological or service monopolies, things that a massive neighbor simply can't copy or outscale.
Which brings us to Section 3, and arguably the biggest takeaway here, No tax hike without growth.
If you remember one thing from this explainer, make it this economic principle. No tax increase without economic growth. The author is super clear on this. Raising taxes on an economy that is already struggling and stagnant, the text claims that will absolutely kill the nation's financial future. It's like trying to squeeze more juice from a totally dried up lemon. You have to grow the lemon first.
The text basically says the government has the fundamental order completely backward. When you're staring down a 900 trillion yen deficit, the state has to act like a turnaround CEO. A failing company doesn't survive by just jacking up prices on its exhausted customers, right? It survives by cutting the fat, innovating, and stimulating new growth. According to the source, only after the economy is actually growing and citizens are wealthier should the government even consider discussing tax increases.
So how do you actually execute that? That brings us to Section 4, Thorough Administrative Reform.
Before any tax talks can happen, the source demands some seriously ruthless administrative reform. The text views the bureaucracy as a bloated, incompetent system that actively hinders recovery. The fixes are highly specific. Drastically cut civil service jobs, crush any internal resistance or sabotage against efficiency, demand private sector levels of productivity from public workers, and aggressively privatize any public sectors that are bleeding taxpayer money.
The author also zeroes in on a very specific target here: public interest corporations. The proposal is to strip away their tax-exempt status if they are turning a profit. The logic is pretty straightforward. If you're operating like a business and making money like a business, you should be treated and taxed exactly like a private business so you can contribute to the national recovery. Finally, we hit Section 5, Public-Private Management Sense.
To make all these reforms actually stick, the text calls for a massive mindset shift. It says civil servants desperately need an entrepreneurial spirit. Instead of just mindlessly administering existing budgets, the government should actively build profit-generating departments. The source even suggests sending bureaucrats out to work at startups or venture capital firms to learn how to take calculated risks and generate wealth. It completely flips the traditional script.
And this mindset has to start at the top, locally too. The text argues that mayors and governors absolutely must possess real business talent. It envisions a world where regions stop passively relying on national tax handouts. Instead, local leaders need to step up like branch managers, actively competing, generating local wealth, attracting new industries, and revitalizing their own specific regions using smart business practices.
To wrap up today's explainer, the source leaves us with a really provocative premise to ponder. We've just looked at a blueprint that demands we treat a 900 trillion yen national debt exactly like a corporate bankruptcy, demanding growth before taxes, ruthless efficiency, and a totally entrepreneurial takeover of the public sector. So what do you think? Can a nation truly be saved by managing it exactly like a struggling enterprise? It's definitely a fascinating lens for national economics and one that absolutely challenges the traditional political playbook. Thanks so much for joining me today as we unpack this source material.